The destiny of 12-year-old Violet Mueller was irrevocably set on March 15, 1871, when she uttered 3 simple words in fragmented English. She claimed that Herr Kellerman was responsible for burning children. A hush descended upon the German immigrant community residing in Milwaukee's 3rd Ward. To them, Johann Kellerman had been the most esteemed baker, a foundational member of St. Michael's Church, and a man celebrated for giving bread to orphans each Sunday. Furthermore, he had been deceased for 2 weeks, discovered frozen within the Milwaukee River in what the police deemed an unfortunate accident. The perplexing question was how an uneducated German girl could possess knowledge of a blaze that had destroyed a tenement in Hamburg 7 years prior, claiming the lives of 6 children. This was an inferno that Johann Kellerman had admitted to setting, speaking in German within the confines of a confessional, where his words were meant only for God, a priest, and a single young interpreter to ever know. Before proceeding with the tale of Violet Mueller and the lethal secrets that established her as the most hazardous child in Milwaukee, it's important to note that the confession records of St. Michael's Church were incinerated just 3 days following Violet's passing. The official reason provided was an accidental blaze, yet Father O'Brien's hands showed powder burns, which he attributed to cleaning his hunting firearm. It appeared that some secrets were deemed valuable enough to warrant the destruction of everything to keep them safe. In 1871, Milwaukee's 3rd Ward throbbed with the cadence of German immigrant existence. Cobblestone streets were lined with bakeries and breweries, which saturated the air with a mixed aroma of newly baked bread and fermenting hops. The district provided a home for nearly 3,000 German immigrants, the majority of whom had escaped financial distress or political oppression in their native country. They arrived carrying their language, their customs, and their transgressions. At the center of this society, St. Michael's Catholic Church rose like a fortress of limestone. From its position at the corner of Cherry and 3rd Streets, its 2 spires stretched skyward. Constructed a mere 8 years before with funds painstakingly collected by immigrant families, the church functioned not just as a house of worship but also as the social and ethical hub of German existence in Milwaukee. Within its walls, marriages received blessings, infants were baptized, and spirits were unburdened inside the confessional. The church confronted a continual difficulty that affected numerous immigrant parishes throughout America: the communication gap between its German parishioners and the Irish clergy. The majority of German immigrants had little to no command of English, whereas the Irish priests appointed to Milwaukee's parishes could seldom speak German. This situation precipitated a deep spiritual dilemma. How could souls receive proper absolution if their confessions could not be comprehended? Father Patrick O'Brien, the parish's head priest, had come from County Cork 5 years prior, bringing with him a name for rigid adherence to church law and a regrettable inclination for potent alcoholic beverages. Father O'Brien was fluent in English and competent in Latin, but his knowledge of German hardly went past Guten Tag and Auf Wiedersehen. His junior colleague, Father Thomas Flanagan, possessed even fewer linguistic skills. The parish was in dire need of interpretation for the sacrament of confession. The answer emerged from an unlikely place. The Mueller family, who had recently emigrated from the Rhineland and taken up residence in a confined tenement on Huron Street. The father, Heinrich Mueller, was employed as a cooper making barrels for the local breweries, while his spouse, Greta, laundered clothes to augment their sparse income. Their daughter, Violet, a 12-year-old with flaxen braids and light blue eyes, had an extraordinary aptitude for languages. Although she had been in America for only 2 years, her English was remarkably fluent, and she could effortlessly translate between German and English with a precision that astounded even the parish's learned men. In the autumn of 1870, Father O'Brien proposed an arrangement to Heinrich Mueller. He asked if they would permit young Violet to act as an interpreter during German confessions. The position offered 50 cents a week, a considerable amount for an impoverished immigrant family, and was to be carried out under the clergy's close watch. Heinrich, a pious Catholic who considered the proposition both a financial blessing and a spiritual duty, quickly consented. Violet commenced her work in November of 1870. On Tuesday and Friday evenings she would come to St. Michael's shortly before Vespers, settle into a small wooden chair next to the confessional, and convey the hushed confessions of guilt and regret that were spoken in her mother tongue. Father O'Brien demanded complete and total secrecy. He instructed Violet to translate precisely and then instantly erase the words from her memory. He repeatedly stressed that the secrets uttered in the confessional were for God's ears alone. The confessional at St. Michael's was an elaborate work of art, fashioned from dark walnut and decorated with sacred icons. It was comprised of 3 sections, a middle chamber for the priest and 2 smaller kneeling areas on each side for penitents to confess through grated screens. This design ensured confidentiality while preserving the sound quality needed for the priest to hear. During her service as an interpreter, Violet was seated in a small nook just behind the priest's section, hidden from the view of the parishioner confessing but positioned to overhear every spoken word. A memory like a steel trap. For the initial few months, the system functioned without issue. Violet accurately relayed the common litany of immigrant wrongdoings, minor thefts driven by hardship, falsehoods told to bosses, outbursts of temper toward children, and improper thoughts regarding neighbors' spouses. Father O'Brien would assign the fitting penance, which Violet would then translate from Latin prayers into German. The arrangement appeared to meet everyone's needs flawlessly. However, Violet Mueller was gifted with a memory of incredible retention, a quality that would ultimately be both a gift and a liability. Although she accurately interpreted every confession and seemed to forget what was said, her mind held onto each detail with perfect clarity. Names, dates, places, and offenses built up in her young mind like silt at the bottom of a river. She never revealed what she learned in the confessional, not to her mother or father, not to any friends, and not even in her own thoughts. She just remembered. The first breach in Violet's meticulously kept silence occurred on a frigid February evening in 1871. Having just concluded a very long session of translating confessions, she was making her way home along the lamp-lit Cherry Street when she met Mrs. Brunilda Zimmerman, the wife of the local baker. Mrs. Zimmerman was recognized for her gentle nature with children and frequently offered Violet small treats when she went by the bakery. "Good evening, little Violet," Mrs. Zimmerman greeted her warmly. "How are your parents? I have not seen your mother at the market this week." "She is sick," Violet answered, clarifying that her mother was suffering from a nagging cough. Their chat continued in German, as was common among the neighborhood's inhabitants. Mrs. Zimmerman conveyed her sympathies and volunteered to deliver some soup for Greta Mueller. "Oh, Mrs. Zimmerman," Violet exclaimed, changing to English as she tended to do when she was excited or emotional. "Not everyone around here is so kind to children. Some people harm children and then pretend to be saints." Mrs. Zimmerman appeared baffled. "What are you saying, my dear? What do you mean, child?" Violet's pale blue eyes took on a far-off look as though she was seeing past Mrs. Zimmerman instead of at her. "There are men who give orphans bread on Sundays but set fire to houses with children still inside back when they were in Germany. God is aware of everything, even the secrets people believe are securely hidden." These words lingered in the frosty February atmosphere like puffs of visible breath. A shiver went through Mrs. Zimmerman that was unrelated to the cold. She was aware of only a single man in their area who provided bread for orphans each Sunday, Johann Kellerman, her husband's business associate and dearest friend. "Violet," Mrs. Zimmerman began cautiously, "what are you discussing? Herr Kellerman is a virtuous man. He would never cause harm to children." Violet blinked as if waking from a dream. The remote expression in her eyes vanished, giving way to bewilderment. I'm not sure why I said that. I need to get home. My mother is expecting me." She quickly departed, leaving Mrs. Zimmerman by herself beneath the glow of the street lamp, her thoughts racing. The precise detail concerning the burning of houses disturbed her profoundly. How could a 12-year-old girl who had lived nearly her entire life in a tiny Rhineland hamlet have any knowledge about fires in Germany? And for what reason would she associate that information with Johann Kellerman? Mrs. Zimmerman resolved to discuss the matter with her husband. Wilhelm Zimmerman had been acquainted with Johann Kellerman for 3 years, from the time the man first came to Milwaukee and opened his bakery just 2 blocks away from their own. Kellerman was reserved, diligent, and deeply religious. He went to Mass each morning, confessed his sins without fail, and gave generously to church fundraisers. The notion that he could have any connection to violence against children felt preposterous. Yet Wilhelm's response to his wife's account was surprising. Rather than writing off Violet's statement as childish fantasy, he became extremely quiet, and his face lost all its color. "What is it?" Brunhilde inquired. "What is the matter?" Wilhelm remained silent for a considerable time, gazing into the flames that heated their the kitchen. At last he began to speak. 3 months back, Johann got a letter from Hamburg. He was deeply troubled after he read it and requested my help in composing a reply. His handwriting is poor, as you know. The message was from a man named Hinrich Brenner, who claimed to be seeking details about a fire in 1864 that had killed children. Brenner indicated that he thought Johann might possess information on how that fire began. Brunhilde's heart began to pound. "What did Johann ask you to write in the response?" "He wanted me to state that he was unaware of any fire, that he had never resided in Hamburg, and that Brenner was mistaken." "But Brunhilde," Wilhelm stopped, his voice lowering to a whisper. "I saw Johann's immigration documents when he first got here. They explicitly named Hamburg as his former place of residence." A pattern of death. The weight of Wilhelm's disclosure descended upon them like a gloomy shroud. If Johann Kellerman had been dishonest about his ties to Hamburg, and if Violet Mueller somehow possessed information about a fire in that city involving children, then it was possible the girl's peculiar words held more truth than either of them wished to acknowledge. A fortnight later, Johann Kellerman's corpse was recovered from the Milwaukee River. The official inquiry determined that he had lost his footing on the frozen riverbank during his walk home from the tavern, hit his head on a stone, and drowned in the shallow depths. The police recorded that Kellerman had been consuming a large amount of alcohol, which made the accident seem entirely believable, a sad conclusion to an immigrant's pursuit of the American dream, and nothing beyond that. The funeral drew a large crowd. Father O'Brien gave a touching eulogy commending Kellerman's dedication to the church and his kindness toward orphaned children. The whole German community grieved the passing of a man they held up as an example, yet as the attendees passed by the casket, 12-year-old Violet Mueller remained at the rear of the church, her light blue eyes fastened on the face of the deceased. After the ceremony, while the congregation congregated outside St. Michael's, Violet went up to Mrs. Zimmerman. Without any preamble, she stated softly, "He admitted to the fire 3 separate times. It was always on a Friday evening. He expressed remorse for the children, but claimed they were about to expose the theft of the money. Each time, Father O'Brien assigned him 20 Hail Marys." The color drained from Mrs. Zimmerman's face. "Violet, how could you know that?" But the girl had already turned and left, rejoining her parents as they made their way home for their evening meal. She left Mrs. Zimmerman on the church steps, shaking not from the chill, but from the dreadful realization that Violet Mueller was privy to knowledge that should have perished with Johann Kellerman. The passing of Johann Kellerman left a somber mood over the German community in Milwaukee's 3rd Ward. In the weeks after his burial, hushed talks in pubs and stores started to shift away from grieving his death and toward questioning the odd circumstances of Violet Mueller's incredible knowledge. Mrs. Zimmerman found herself unable to rest, disturbed by the girl's specific statements about confession times and assigned penances. She had known Johann Kellerman for 3 years and had not once observed him using the confessional on any day other than a Friday evening. His habit was as predictable as a timepiece. He would arrive at St. Michael's at 7 o'clock, kneel in the confessional's left chamber, and then reappear 20 minutes later to pray for an extended period at the altar rail. The reality that a 12-year-old girl could name not just his confession times but also the precise penance he was given implied she had access to information that should have been impossible for her to have. Disturbed by her increasing doubts, Mrs. Zimmerman chose to undertake her own discreet inquiry. She started visiting the church more regularly, watching the confession routines and taking note of which parishioners came on which days. Her findings only intensified her unease regarding Violet Mueller's function in the parish. The girl's placement during the confession periods was more significant than anyone had understood. From her little nook behind the priest's chamber, Violet could overhear not just the words being interpreted, but the entire confession process. She was privy to the assignment of penance, she heard Father O'Brien's counsel and absolution, and she saw the behavioral habits of every German parishioner who came seeking pardon for their sins. In effect, she had turned into a living archive of the deepest secrets of the whole immigrant population. Mrs. Zimmerman's inquiry brought to light another disturbing trend. In the preceding 4 months, 3 additional men who consistently confessed on Friday evenings had passed away in situations that, though not raising enough suspicion for a police probe, seemed strikingly coincidental. Klaus Brenner, a brewery employee, had been fatally injured by a toppling barrel in January. Otto Steinberg, a woodworker, had plunged from a church roof he was mending in December. Hinrich Wulmer, a pub owner, had died from a sudden heart attack while playing cards in November. All 3 individuals had been comparatively young, aged between 35 and 45, and had no history of health issues. All 3 had been consistent Friday evening confessors, and all 3 had died shortly after Johann Kellerman got the letter from Hamburg concerning the fire. The more Mrs. Zimmerman contemplated these deaths, the more certain she grew that they were intertwined. If Violet Mueller knew about grave offenses committed by these men, and if that information had somehow been made public, then it was possible someone was making sure those offenses would never be looked into. Her doubts were solidified when she met Violet one March evening near Wulmer's old pub. The structure had been sealed with boards since Hinrich's passing, as his widow had sold it to clear his debts. Violet was gazing at the darkened panes with the same remote look Mrs. Zimmerman had noticed previously. "He confined children in the cellar," Violet stated softly, seemingly speaking to no one. "For 3 years he kept children imprisoned in the cellar and sold them to men who harmed them. He went to confession every Friday because he was unable to stop, but he was unable to stop because the financial reward was too great. Father O'Brien advised him to pray for resolve, but Heinrich claimed the children's weeping gave him terrible dreams." Mrs. Zimmerman was overcome with nausea. The implications of what Violet said were dreadful, not just for the crimes she detailed, but because they pointed to a pattern of knowledge that went far beyond a single admission about a fire in Germany. "Violet," she began gently, "how are you aware of these things?" The girl looked at her with those disquieting, pale blue eyes. "I recall everything, Mrs. Zimmerman. Every single word, every name, every transgression. I recall Klaus Brenner speaking about the workers he shoved into the vat of scalding beer because they found out he was stealing. I recall Otto Steinberg admitting to the murder of his brother in Germany to get his inheritance. I recall them all. But Violet," Mrs. Zimmerman uttered, her voice barely audible, "those are confessions. They are meant to be kept secret. Taboo." "Hey, our secret," Violet answered matter-of-factly. "I don't tell anyone what people admit to, but at times, the words just escape when I encounter places or individuals that trigger the memory. I am powerless to stop it." The girl departed, leaving Mrs. Zimmerman with the dreadful understanding that Violet Mueller was not purposefully violating the sacredness of confession. She was instead afflicted by a psychological state that rendered her incapable of keeping her vast, accumulated knowledge of criminal confessions separate from her everyday speech. The secrets were literally escaping her, and every disclosure placed her in grave peril from individuals who had already killed to safeguard those very secrets. Mrs. Zimmerman understood she needed to alert someone to the predicament, yet she was in an unsolvable bind. If she informed Father O'Brien that his interpreter was unintentionally disclosing confidential information from confessions, Violet would be dismissed from her role and her family would face financial hardship. If she reported the crimes Violet had mentioned to the authorities, her accusations would be founded on information from confessions that was obtained illicitly. and if she revealed this to other German community members, she could be effectively condemning Violet to death. As March turned into April, Mrs. Zimmerman saw that Violet's unprompted disclosures were happening more often and with greater detail. The girl appeared to be losing the internal restraint that had previously kept her knowledge from confessions under control. Concurrently, Mrs. Zimmerman noted that a number of long-standing parishioners had ceased coming to Friday evening confession. Men who had been attending confession regularly for years suddenly started to steer clear of the church completely or began attending Saturday morning services when Violet was not there. The German community was starting to grasp that their secrets were no longer secure, and a decision would have to be made about the girl who possessed too much information. Father Patrick O'Brien initially observed the decrease in Friday evening confessions in the second week of April. For many months, the German confession times had been reliably busy, with 15 to 20 parishioners coming for absolution weekly. All at once, that figure had fallen to less than 6, and the few who came appeared on edge and hurried through their confessions. At first, Father O'Brien linked this shift to the recent passings within the community. He thought that sorrow could influence people's religious habits in unforeseen ways. Some might turn to more regular confession as a means to cope with their bereavement, while others could pull away from their religious duties entirely. However, as this trend continued, he started to consider a more worrisome cause. The priest's doubts were substantiated when Wilhelm Zimmermann asked for a confidential discussion in the church sacristy. Wilhelm stood as one of the parish's most steadfast members, a man whose financial support for church initiatives and consistent presence at services established him as a key figure in the German community. When he came to St. Michael's on a Tuesday afternoon looking clearly distressed and requesting a private word, Father O'Brien was certain something was deeply amiss. "Father," Wilhelm started in his distinctly accented English, "I need to discuss the confession interpretations with you." "What is the issue with them, Wilhelm? Has young Violet been making mistakes?" Wilhelm shook his head. "No, Father. Her interpretations are flawless. That is the issue." For the following hour, Wilhelm meticulously recounted what his wife had told him about Violet's unsettling disclosures. He detailed the girl's precise knowledge of Johann Kellermann's confession habits, her in-depth awareness of the penances given, and her seeming powerlessness to hold the secrets of the confessional within her mind. Most alarmingly, he relayed Violet's assertions about Heinrich Wulmer's offenses against children. Father O'Brien absorbed Wilhelm's story with rising dread. As a priest, he knew the inviolable nature of confessional secrecy. The holiness of the sacrament of penance rested completely on the penitent's trust that their sins would remain undisclosed. If rumors began that confessions were being unintentionally leaked, it would not only shatter the spiritual bedrock of his parish, but also potentially ruin his entire ecclesiastical career. "Wilhelm," Father O'Brien said cautiously, "are you positive about what your wife witnessed? Is it possible the girl was fabricating these things, or maybe just echoing rumors she picked up somewhere else?" Wilhelm's face was somber. "Father, after Violet mentioned children in the basement, my wife requested that I inspect Heinrich Wulmer's property. I approached his widow stating my interest in buying the structure. She granted me permission to conduct a thorough search of the basement." Father O'Brien's stomach clenched. "And?" "There are restraints fastened to the walls, Father. Iron chains connected to support posts, sized for children. The floor has stains that appear to be blood, and there are marks on the walls that seem to have been made by fingernails." Wilhelm paused, his voice unsteady. "No one could invent such specific details, Father. Violet is aware of these things because she heard Heinrich admit to them." The weight of Wilhelm's findings struck Father O'Brien like a physical impact. If Violet Mueller held accurate information about Heinrich Wulmer's crimes, it was probable she also knew the accurate details of other confessed offenses. The deaths of Kellermann, Brenner, Steinberg, and Wulmer suddenly appeared much more menacing. It was possible these men had not died accidentally or from natural causes. Perhaps, as someone was methodically getting rid of individuals whose confessed wrongdoings had been exposed through Violet's revelations. Father, Wilhelm went on, there's more. My wife thinks that knowledge of what Violet knows might have already gotten out beyond her immediate family. Others in the community are starting to inquire about the men who passed away. Some are beginning to question if their deaths were truly accidental. Father O'Brien saw he was in the middle of a crisis that could ruin his parish and possibly result in loss of life, including Violet's. If the girl kept unintentionally disclosing secrets from the confessional, she would become a target for anyone whose offenses she had heard. Simultaneously, if news got out that confessions at St. Michael's were not private, it would erode the spiritual core of the entire German community. What do you suggest should be done, Wilhelm? Wilhelm remained silent for a long while. Father, I believe Violet Mueller must cease interpreting confessions at once, for her own well-being and for the well-being of others. But Wilhelm, her help is essential to us. Without her interpretation, our German parishioners are unable to confess their sins correctly. Father, Wilhelm said softly, I believe the sins of our German parishioners might be more perilous than their souls can handle. That evening, Father O'Brien came to a decision that would trouble him for the remainder of his days. Rather than relieving Violet of her interpretive duties, he chose to gauge the full scope of her knowledge. He believed that if he could grasp precisely what she knew and the manner in which she was revealing it, he might discover a resolution that safeguarded both the girl and the parish. Following that Friday's confession period, Father O'Brien requested that Violet stay behind in the church for a private talk. He guided her to a small room located behind the altar where church supplies were key, guaranteeing absolute privacy for their conversation. Violet, he started in a gentle tone, I have been told that you occasionally speak of matters you have learned during confession. Can you see why this is a cause for my concern? The girl gazed up at him with her unsettling pale blue eyes. I do not intend to reveal secrets, Father. They simply emerge at times when I encounter things that trigger my memory. Can you describe for me the kinds of things that act as reminders? Violet gave the question serious thought. When I am in places where terrible events occurred, or when I encounter individuals who resemble the people who confessed, the words just escape me. For instance, when I saw Herr Kellermann's bakery after he passed away, I was unable to stop thinking about the children in Hamburg. Father O'Brien's mouth became parched. Violet, what were the exact details Herr Kellermann shared with you concerning Hamburg? He stated that he ignited a fire in a tenement building because the children residing there had witnessed him pilfering money from the church's donation box. He explained that he placed oil-soaked rags beneath the staircase and set them ablaze at night while everyone was asleep. He mentioned that 6 children perished, but he escaped with the money and journeyed to America. He felt remorse for the children, but contended that destitution drives people to commit dreadful acts. The priest felt a wave of sickness. The precise details in Violet's story, the oily rags, the placement under the stairs, the motive connected to church theft, had a ring of truth that could only have come from a direct confession. If Johann Kellermann had, in fact, committed mass murder in Germany, his demise in the Milwaukee River started to seem less like a mishap and more like a form of justice. Violet, Father O'Brien asked cautiously, to whom else have you spoken about Herr Kellermann's confession? Only to Mrs. Zimmermann, but I suspect others are aware anyway, as I've overheard men discussing him in the taverns. They remarked that he received what he was due. Father O'Brien grasped that Violet's knowledge was disseminating through the German community like concentric waves in a pond. Even if she wasn't purposefully disclosing secrets from the confessional, her unintentional remarks were sparking conjecture and inquiries that were bringing long-hidden crimes to light. The situation was escalating beyond his control and would soon be uncontainable. Violet, I need you to make me a promise. Can you make a great effort not to bring up anything you hear during confessions? Can you attempt to hold those thoughts within your mind? The girl looked at him with an expression of true anguish. I do try, Father. I try with all my might. But at times the thoughts are so powerful that they must be released. It is akin to water held back by a dam. When cracks form in the dam, the water begins to seep out, even against your will. Father O'Brien then realized that Violet Mueller was not intentionally betraying secrets from the confessional. She was a child whose extraordinary memory had grown too much to handle, whose mind was no longer able to bear the increasing burden of other people's transgressions. She was a casualty of her situation, yet she also posed a direct threat to the existence of everyone whose crimes she had heard. While accompanying Violet home that evening, Father O'Brien made another choice that would lead to significant repercussions. Rather than safeguarding the girl by taking her off her translation duties, he chose to safeguard the parish by creating a record of all she knew. He thought that if Violet's knowledge was bound to come out regardless, it would be more prudent to possess a full account of the information to help manage the unfolding crisis. Over the subsequent weeks, Father O'Brien started holding what he termed memory sessions with Violet. Used as an effort to help her manage and let go of distressing information, he methodically drew out every piece of information she could recall from the confessions she had interpreted. The things he learned were far more terrible than he had anticipated. Violet's memory held proof of numerous grave offenses: murders, arson, thefts, assaults, child abuse, and fraud. The German immigrant community in Milwaukee's Third Ward was providing refuge to men who had escaped the law in Europe and were still committing crimes in America. The confessional at St. Michael's had turned into a storage for the sins of a whole community of runaways. Father O'Brien recorded Violet's disclosures in 3 leather-bound journals, effectively compiling a detailed criminal case against his own parish. As he documented each dreadful detail, he started to see why men like Kellerman, Brenner, Steinberg, and Woolmer had met their end. Another person was aware of what Violet knew and was using that information to carry out a harsh form of street justice. The question that tormented Father O'Brien was straightforward. Who else was privy to what Violet knew, and what measures would they take to guard their own secrets? The answer to Father O'Brien's query arrived in the person of Hans Richter, a man whose standing in Milwaukee's German community had consistently been both significant and enigmatic. Richter was the proprietor of 3 enterprises in the Third Ward, a brewery, a boarding house, and a meat processing facility, and his sway reached well beyond his financial assets. Men came to him for guidance on business dealings. Families took loans from him in times of hardship, and even the parish leadership sought his opinion on important matters that concerned the German community. What made Richter especially powerful was his standing as someone who could resolve issues that others found insurmountable. When Wilhelm Hoffmann's adolescent son was apprehended for stealing from just when it seemed things could not get worse, the terror in Milwaukee's Third Ward deepens. If this tale is sending shivers down your spine, please share this video with a friend who appreciates dark historical puzzles. Press the like button to show your support for our work, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss out on stories like this. Let's find out together what unfolds next. Father O'Brien's hands shook as he gripped the menacing note. The rough German handwriting was a match for samples he had seen in Hans Richter's business letters, and the message's bluntness was typical of the man's preference for resolving issues through fear. Yet, what most disturbed the priest was not the threat itself, but the moment it was delivered. The note had been left in the confessional at some point between the middle of the night and sunrise, a time when St. Michael's was locked and thought to be safe. This implied that Hans Richter either had keys to the church, had allies among the parish workers, or his power within the community was even greater than Father O'Brien had imagined. The act of desecrating a holy place signified an escalation, hinting that Richter was ready to take extreme measures to silence Violet Mueller. Father O'Brien made a quick decision that would turn out to be both sensible and tragically inadequate. He called Heinrich Mueller to the church that same afternoon, presented him with the threatening note, and explained that his daughter's well-being demanded swift action. "Heinrich," the priest said with urgency, "you must get Violet out of Milwaukee immediately, this very night." Heinrich examined the note with rising fear. As a German immigrant who had escaped political oppression in his native country, he grasped the grave nature of written threats. "Where are we to go, Father?" "Bring her to Chicago. I have connections at St. Alphonsus Parish who—" Can offer you a temporary place to stay while you look for employment. Do not inform anyone of your destination and do not come back until I notify you that it is safe." Hinrich gave a somber nod. "And what of Greta? She is not well enough to travel." "Entrust Greta to the Zimmermans. Wilhelm and Brunhilde will look after her until she is strong enough to come to you. The crucial thing is to remove Violet from Milwaukee before the person who wrote this note decides on a more direct course of action." That evening, as the shadows grew long across the Third Ward, Hinrich Mueller gathered a small bundle of his daughter's possessions and got ready for their journey. Violet appeared to grasp the seriousness of the situation without needing a full explanation. Her typically bright disposition had given way to a quiet vigilance that made her seem more mature than her 12 years. "Papa," she asked as they got ready to depart from their tenement on Huron Street, "are we going away because of the things I mentioned about the men who passed away?" Hinrich knelt to look his daughter in the eyes. "Violet, you have done nothing wrong. At times adults do terrible things, and when children are aware of those terrible things, it can become unsafe for them. We are leaving to ensure your safety. Will we ever return, Leach? When it is safe." Father O'Brien had made arrangements for Wilhelm Zimmermann to transport the Muellers to the railway station in his brewery cart, hiding them among barrels and sacks of grain to go unnoticed. The strategy was straightforward. Hinrich and Violet would board the night train to Chicago, where Father McKenna at St. Alphonsus Parish would offer them refuge until a more permanent solution could be found. The strategy was unsuccessful because Hans Richter had foreseen it. As Wilhelm's cart neared the Milwaukee Road depot, 3 figures stepped out from the darkness close to the platform. Richter himself was positioned in the middle, with 2 of his men on either side, whom Wilhelm knew as workers from Richter's meatpacking plant. Each of the 3 men held a walking cane that could readily be used as a weapon. "A good evening to you, Wilhelm," Richter said in a friendly tone. "A fine night for a journey." Wilhelm halted his cart, his thoughts scrambling for a way out. The train station was too crowded for overt violence, yet it was also too secluded for anyone to help if Richter chose to make a move. "Good evening, Hans. I'm just dropping off some goods at the depot's warehouse." Richter strode toward the cart with an air of relaxed assurance. "I believe you are dropping off something far more precious than goods, Wilhelm. I believe you are dropping off the young interpreter who has created so much difficulty for our community." From under the sacks of grain, Violet's muffled voice emerged. "He set fire to the church documents, Papa. He set fire to the confession documents so that no one would discover the money he took from the donation box." These words struck Richter like a physical assault. His easygoing manner disappeared, replaced by a cold rage. "Remove them from the cart immediately." Wilhelm understood that to resist would be pointless. Richter's men were younger and more powerful, and they had selected the spot with care to ensure there would be no onlookers. With great unwillingness, he assisted Hinrich and Violet as they emerged from their hiding spot among the barrels. Richter observed Violet with the detached gaze of a butcher assessing cattle. "So, you are the young lady who recalls everything. Inform me, child, what other things do you recall about me?" Violet met his gaze with her unsettling pale blue eyes. "You admit, Ted, to Father O'Brien that you killed your brother in Hamburg to take his identification papers. You stated that you required his identity to travel to America because you were wanted by the police. You mentioned that you shoved him into the harbor and informed everyone that he was intoxicated and had fallen in. You expressed remorse but said you could not face imprisonment." Richter's face turned ashen. The confession Violet recounted had occurred during his first week in Milwaukee over 4 years prior. This was information that could not only ruin his standing and his businesses, but also lead to his deportation and execution in Germany. "You have overheard an adequate number of confessions, young interpreter," Richter stated softly. "The time has come for you to make your own." The events that followed would be a subject of debate among investigators for many years. Wilhelm Zimmermann would later state under oath that Richter seized Violet by the arm and started to pull her toward the river that flowed behind the train station. Hinrich Mueller cried out for assistance and tried to step in, only to be knocked to the ground by one of Richter's men. Violet let out a scream, and her cries were audible to passengers waiting on the platform. However, Violet Mueller's destiny was determined not by Hans Richter's brutality, but by her own exceptional memory. As Richter pulled her toward the river, she started to list every crime she had ever heard him confess to. She detailed murders in Hamburg, thefts in Milwaukee, payments made to corrupt police officers, and warnings issued to competitors. She recounted dates, names, places, and techniques with the accuracy of a court reporter. "Be silent," Richter yelled, but Violet was unable to stop. The shock of the situation had set off the same psychological response that had previously caused her to blurt out confessional secrets in everyday talk. In a state of extreme distress, her mind let go of its stored burden of criminal knowledge in a torrent of precise, incriminating details. Passengers on the train and workers at the depot overheard parts of Violet's recital. They heard her identify Hans Richter as a murderer and a thief. They heard her list offenses that portrayed him as one of the most dangerous individuals in Milwaukee's German community. And they heard her last words just before Richter's hand tightened around her throat. "You murdered all of them because they were aware of the stolen funds. You murdered Kellerman and Brenner and Steinberg and Woolmer because I informed people of what they had confessed. But you cannot murder everyone who is aware of your secrets because God is aware of your secrets as well." Hans Richter managed to silence Violet Mueller that night by the Milwaukee River, but he was unable to silence the truth she had revealed. An excessive number of people had overheard too much of her final statement. In a matter of hours, the Milwaukee police were on the hunt for Richter, using witness reports of the crimes Violet had detailed as their guide. Within a few days, inquiries had begun into the deaths of Kellerman, Brenner, Steinberg, and Woolmer. In a few weeks, evidence had been found that supported many of Violet's assertions. Hans Richter was never apprehended. He vanished from Milwaukee on the same night Violet died, abandoning his companies, his assets, and his meticulously built persona. It was said by some that he escaped to California. Others thought he went back to Germany. A small number whispered that he had been killed by other German community members who held him responsible for drawing unwanted scrutiny to their secrets. Heinrich Mueller made it through the assault, but was left with lasting injuries that put an end to his work as a cooper. He dedicated the remainder of his days to pursuing justice for his daughter's killing, sending letters to police forces all over the country and employing private detectives to find Hans Richter. Although he never located the man who took Violet's life, his persistence ensured the case remained in the public's mind long after the official inquiries were concluded. The passing of Violet Mueller created tremors throughout Milwaukee's German community that went well beyond the immediate sorrow of a child's murder. In the weeks after her death, as police inquiries brought forth evidence that backed up many of her final statements, the community started to grasp the full measure of their loss. Father O'Brien, overcome with grief for his inability to safeguard Violet, made a choice that would shape the rest of his ecclesiastical life. He took the 3 journals that held Violet's accounts of confessions and personally handed them over to the Milwaukee Police Department, fully aware of the canonical rules this act broke. His statement gave investigators extensive details on numerous unsolved crimes, which resulted in arrests, guilty verdicts, and the uncovering of a criminal organization that had been active within the German immigrant community for a long time. The priest's assistance with the police led to a reprimand from church officials, but earned him the respect of the law enforcement community. Detective Captain Michael Donahue, who was in charge of the investigation into Violet's death, later noted that Father O'Brien's journals were the most thorough piece of criminal information ever supplied by a single individual in the annals of Milwaukee law enforcement. The journals made it clear that the German immigrant population of the Third Ward had become a haven for a remarkable number of escapees from European law, men who had committed acts of murder, arson, theft, and assault in Germany had sought refuge in America under new names, convinced that their past offenses would stay hidden forever. The confessional at St. Michael's had unintentionally turned into a storage for the proof of these crimes, with Violet Mueller acting as an unwitting observer of decades of criminal admissions. Wilhelm Zimmermann, having been present during Violet's final moments, emerged as the key witness in the prosecution against Hans Richter. His account helped investigators piece together how Richter had methodically disposed of men whose confessed wrongdoings had been exposed by Violet's disclosures. The deaths of Kellerman, Brenner, Steinberg, and Woolmer were recategorized as murders, with Richter named as the main person of interest in all 4 instances. The inquiry also brought to light the financial reasons behind Richter's crimes. As the proprietor of several businesses in the Third Ward, Richter had gained immense wealth from the illicit dealings of his fellow immigrants. He had offered services for laundering money from stolen items, supplied false identity papers for fugitives, and run extortion schemes that squeezed payments from men whose criminal histories left them open to blackmail. Violet's disclosures had posed a threat not only to specific criminals but to a whole clandestine economy that Richter had established and managed. Brunhilde Zimmermann, who was the first to hear Violet's unsettling statements about Johann Kellerman, dedicated years to recording the girl's story for historical record. Her comprehensive narrative, first penned in German and later translated to English, stands as the main reference for comprehending how vile its remarkable memory turned her from a blameless child into a direct danger to criminal fugitives. She was merely a young girl who remembered it all, Mrs. Zimmermann recorded. In another era and another setting, her talent would have destined her to be a scholar or an educator, but within our community at that particular time, her memory rendered her the most perilous individual in Milwaukee. The incident had a profound and enduring impact on the practices of Catholic confession in immigrant populations all over America. Church leaders established fresh guidelines for translation services, mandating the use of adult interpreters and putting in place measures to safeguard the confidentiality of confessions. The Milwaukee Protocol, as it came to be called, was put into practice by parishes across the country to avert similar disasters. St. Michael's Church kept on serving the German community, but it never again used child interpreters for the sacrament of confession. A modest commemorative plaque near the church's main door honors Violet Mueller as a child whose purity was sacrificed in the name of God's compassion. This plaque, put up by Father O'Brien just before he retired, features a passage from the scriptures. "Let the little children come to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Hinrich Mueller did not remarry after his wife Greta passed away from pneumonia 6 months following Violet's death. He lived out his final years employed as a night guard, all the while persisting in his fruitless hunt for Hans Richter. His last communication with the Milwaukee Police Department, composed shortly before his death in 1891, conveyed his conviction that Richter was still alive and remained a threat. A man who is capable of killing a child to safeguard his secrets will never cease to flee from those secrets. Detective Captain Donahue, who worked on the case until he retired in 1895, held a firm belief that Hans Richter had taken on a new persona somewhere in the American West. Individuals like Richter do not simply vanish, he noted in his memoirs. They reinvent their identities and carry on their predatory ways in different places. Somewhere in America there is likely a businessman or a respected community figure who was once Hans Richter of Milwaukee, and he is probably still taking advantage of defenseless people to keep his secrets hidden. The official file on Violet Mueller's murder stayed active until 1920, at which point the Milwaukee police officially declared Hans Richter deceased by law. By then, every key witness had passed away, and the leads had become too old to pursue. Nevertheless, the case set significant legal examples for handling crimes in immigrant populations and showed the importance of safeguarding witnesses who held dangerous information. Contemporary criminologists who have examined the case observe that Violet Mueller was, in essence, the casualty of an early type of witness removal. Her killing was a deliberate move to silence an individual whose statements could have brought to light extensive criminal operations. The fact that she was a child made her especially defenseless, but it also lent a particular weight of credibility to her words for the detectives who later took on the case. The cellar of Heinrich Wulmer's old pub, where Violet had asserted that children were held captive and mistreated, was carefully dug up by the police in the months after her passing. The inquiry verified the presence of restraints, blood residue, and other proof that backed up Violet's statements. This finding resulted in the identification of a number of children who had been reported missing and the legal proceedings against the remaining members of Wulmer's criminal group. In a final chilling development in the case, construction workers tearing down the building in 1923 found a secret chamber that held meticulous documentation of Wulmer's offenses. These papers, written in German, listed names, dates, and financial details connected to the trafficking of children. Included in these documents was a letter sent to Hans Richter that confirmed their business association and outlined the profit-sharing terms for their illicit ventures. This finding, which occurred more than 5 decades after Violet's death, served as the ultimate proof of the truthfulness of her statements. The 12-year-old girl, who had been disregarded by some as a daydreamer or someone seeking attention, had been speaking the truth about crimes so heinous that adults struggled to even imagine them. The narrative of Violet Mueller acts as a cautionary tale that wickedness frequently conceals itself behind a veneer of social standing, and that the most defenseless individuals in a community, children, immigrants, the impoverished, are frequently the sole observers of offenses that influential people are desperate to keep hidden. Her memory, which ought to have been a blessing, turned into a fatal burden that ultimately took her life. Yet her bravery in voicing the truth, even in the most dreadful situations, was instrumental in uncovering a ring of criminals who might have otherwise persisted in their harmful activities without end. This enigmatic story illustrates for us the swiftness with which the innocent can be transformed into a threat when they jeopardize the secrets that malevolent men are willing to kill to safeguard. What are your thoughts on this tale? Do you feel that the whole story has been brought to light? Please post your opinions in the comments section below. If you found this account compelling and are eager for more horror narratives of this kind, please subscribe, activate the notification bell, and pass this along to someone who has a passion for mysteries. We will see you in the subsequent video.